For over a half a century, Hollywood films have dealt with Nazism and the Holocaust in complex and often contradictory ways, marked by outrage and indifference, compassion and ignorance, the need to understand, and a desire to forget. And yet, while this most horrific chapter in modern world history happened far from America's shores, it has been American movies, perhaps more than any other medium, that have shaped how we understand and remember these events.
Of all art forms, film is the one that gives the greatest illusion of authenticity, of truth. A motion picture takes a viewer inside where real people are supposedly doing real things. We assume that there is a certain verisimilitude, a certain authenticity, but there is always some degree of manipulation, some degree of distortion.
Unless you are doing a totally abstract movie, you are dealing with a realistic thing. You're dealing with a wall, a frying pan, a human face. The vocabulary is literal. So the problem comes for a movie maker. How do I take this literal vocabulary and find a representative image of something that is so outside the realm of any human experience?
The Holocaust is perhaps the most difficult story to put on film. And I think the reason Hollywood hasn't made many Holocaust pictures is because it's an ineffable experience only understood by those who survived the camps.
It's impossible to do it total justice. It is impossible. You can never duplicate it. You can never deliver it so that the survivors would look at it and say, yes, you've told the story accurately, the memory is lived up to, that's as bad as it was. It's never going to be as bad as it was. You can never portray it. But the dilemma is, should you not do it?
Na, du hast da ja wieder schön was angerichtet.
Wieso ich? Also, wie heißen Sie?
Long before the Second World War, Hollywood and Germany already had a complex relationship. From the late 1920s, Germany meant big business for the studios, accounting for 10% of a foreign market that sustained the film industry. So from the moment Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Hollywood treated Nazism with kid gloves.
It's a big night for the younger Hitler set. The college boys are making Berlin safe for Nazis by burning up books that might lead Germans astray.
Even the newsreels, which were produced and distributed by the major studios, ignored the implicit threat in Nazi propaganda, often recycling it uncritically for the American audience.
20,000 volumes went up in smoke to provide...
The 1933 book burning was enormously visual. Some of the newsreels treated it as students on a prank, and it's a high time in the Nazi universe. The parades, the stormtroopers, all of these symbols of an emergent nationalism were what captivated, and only a few paid attention to the emergence of Nazi racism. I don't think it's fair to say that propaganda worked with Hollywood. I think it's fair to say that the visual imagery is what captivated Hollywood.
Hollywood in the 1930s seemed to bend over backwards to avoid offending the Germans. When the Nazis demanded that the studios fire their Jewish representatives who were working in Germany, nearly all of the studios complied. Yet the studio executives were themselves Eastern European Jewish immigrants.
Psychologically, the Hollywood moguls did not want to call attention to themselves as Jews. They wanted to be identified as Americans. And they didn't want there to be any idea whatsoever that they had an allegiance to anything other than America.
What's more, Hollywood was discouraged from addressing Nazism by its own self-policing production code. The code regulated not only sexual material, but political content as well. And one of its chief goals was protecting the industry's economic interests abroad. Regulation number 10, Article 2, stated that the institutions and prominent people of all nations shall be represented fairly. This included Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. After the night of November 9th, 1938, when synagogues throughout Germany were set on fire and thousands of Jewish-owned businesses looted and destroyed, there was a growing awareness in America that something terrible was happening abroad. Some of Hollywood's top executives worked to help refugees and scrambled to save their relatives still in Europe. Carl Laemmle of Universal managed to bring to the United States nearly all of the Jews from the small town in Germany where he was born. Others in Hollywood openly spoke out against Nazism. Many joined Hollywood's Anti-Nazi League, which sponsored radio shows, printed a weekly newspaper, and urged boycotts of German products.
That all economic connections between the United States of America and Nazi Germany be totally severed.
But the effort was primarily off-screen. The major Hollywood films of the time rarely dealt with the growing Nazi menace, as the industry itself was often the target of anti-Semitic threats from groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Legion. Hollywood was also under attack by the German Bund, an organization of over 10,000 German Americans that openly supported Hitler.
Movie people were getting all kinds of threats during that period. From German, not necessarily Nazis, but you know, there was a large German population in America. They were protective, let's say, of Hitler. They didn't want to see Germany attacked in film.
The Hollywood moguls were afraid. We forget now that there were individuals in Congress like John Rankin, representative of Mississippi, who went on the floor of Congress and would use words like kike and would cite the fact that the motion picture industry was controlled by these unchristian Jews.
We stand as always.
But not all of Hollywood's leaders shied away from controversy.
Drive them from their secret meeting places, destroy their insidious propaganda machines, drive out their bunds and their leagues.
Harry Warner was consumed with the threat of fascism.
The shirts, the black shirts, and the dirty shirts.
Warner Brothers, the studio he ran with his brother Jack, often pursued stories taken from the headlines of the day.
Warner's always had a little touch of politics in it, and also they dealt more with the nitty-gritty of life.
Come on, boys, keep moving here. Come on, get out of here. All right, come on, there's no jobs here, fellas. Come on, move, don't gang up.
They dealt with unemployment, they dealt with the Depression, they dealt with groups that were stirring up anti-democratic principles.
What do you want? We want you, dumb
They were much more in tune with the times than the other studios were.
Yeah, that's him. Our committee has decided that you're an undesirable alien, so you're leaving town right now. If we unite with
Keenly sensitive to a growing fascist movement within the United States, the Warners made films that revealed the growing domestic threat, while at the same time clearly alluding to Hitler's Germany.
till once more our beloved Stars and Stripes will wave over the United Nations, a free, white, 100% American.
When in 1938, the American public became fascinated by the capture and trial of a domestic Nazi spy ring in New York, Warner Brothers quickly snapped up the rights, despite political pressures to lay off the subject.
I'm in the German Secret Service now. You're? Yeah, and one of their most trusted men. I get my instructions from Hitler himself.
Yes, I love America. And I love it all the more because I realize that its deepest roots are essentially German.
Confessions of a Nazi Spy was the first of a handful of anti-Nazi features produced by major studios in the late 30s. The production prompted genuine fear among employees of Warner Brothers. More than half of the cast requested their names not appear in the credits. And the part of Adolf Hitler was dropped when Warner Brothers could not find a single actor willing to play the role. Codenamed The Confessions of Nancy Drew, the entire production was held tightly under wraps.
I was a mailboy in the mailroom, and I was one of the 2 or 3 messengers that delivered the scripts. And the script was given to me in a sealed envelope, and as I delivered it, an officer came along with me, and I thought, what is that?
Warner's released the film with a fanfare of publicity, proclaiming their movie brave and unprecedented. But the studio came under attack. Ultimately, the film was banned in almost every European country. Hollywood studios continued to avoid movies with anti-Nazi themes. A rare exception was MGM's The Mortal Storm, starring Jimmy Stewart, Margaret Sullivan, and Frank Morgan.
Mortal Storm is the story of a Jewish family that is a very noble Jewish family in Germany. The father is a professor and so forth, who are confronted with the rise of Hitler, and they become victims of this whole movement.
Herr Professor and Frau Professor, something wonderful has happened. We have just heard. They have made Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany.
Well, that's stupendous. If it's true. Is it official?
It is true. It is official.
But Fritz, now that this man's come to power, what about those who think differently? Freely? Those who are non-Aryan?
Before we resume, are there any questions?
The Mortal Storm played up the contrast between Nazi intolerance and American diversity.
Is it your opinion that there is no difference between the blood of an Aryan and the blood of a non-Aryan?
Yet it failed to address the darkest aspect of Nazi ideology, anti-Semitism.
Physiology has been unable to discover any difference in the blood of the various races.
Do you hear that?
The film is essentially written in code, because you never hear the word Jew.
It's an immediate defense of racial degeneration, and it's a lie.
Now, clearly, that's what's going on in the film. But instead of Jew, you hear non-Aryan.
I demand that every loyal follower of our leader leave this room immediately.
When we tell World War II stories, we don't follow the Nazis' lead. We somehow create the illusion that this is about something other than the Jews, which is absurd. The Nazis would find this laughable. The Nazis would say, what are you doing? It's all about the Jews.
I played Rudy, who is the son of the professor, and there was a scene in which Rudy comes home and says to his father, I have been mistreated at school, threatening me and so forth because I'm a Jew and I don't understand. And his father in this scene explains to him what it is to be a Jew, about the heritage and so forth. The producer, I recall, coming down to the set and he says, we cut that scene, and you'll notice in the whole film, nobody ever says Jew. It's non-Aryan, but nobody ever says that I am a Jew, that he's Jewish and so forth. And he said that with a certain amount of pride.
Director Frank Borzage told the press that The Mortal Storm was a human interest story, only incidentally set against the backdrop of Nazi Germany. Nevertheless, Germany reacted swiftly to the movie's release. A representative of the German consulate warned that those involved would be remembered after a German victory in the war. And it was rumored that Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels himself, called Louis B. Mayer to complain. Germany soon banned the distribution of all MGM films. Politicians in Washington also were alarmed at what they saw as Hollywood's warmongering. Joseph Kennedy, ambassador to England and a staunch isolationist, flew to Hollywood to convene a meeting of the heads of the studios.
He said to them, I warn you, do not press for American involvement in this conflict, because this will be seen as your war. And that had a very chilling effect on the Jews of Hollywood.
Not surprisingly, the most notable anti-Nazi film to open in Hollywood was not produced by Hollywood at all. The Great Dictator, which premiered in 1940, was produced, directed, and financed by its star, a man who was considered the second most famous person in the world after Adolf Hitler, Charlie Chaplin.
I've got an idea, a bright idea. Sure, let's hear it.
Chaplin made an incredibly ambitious film for 1940. Remember, we're in pre-Pearl Harbor America, neutral America, don't rock the boat America. And Chaplin makes a film in which he plays both the Jewish barber and the ranting tyrant Hinkle, who's obviously Hitler.
Charlie Chaplin was a very wealthy man and financed his own films. He decided he wanted to make fun of Hitler. And so he did it without caring whether it made money or not.
I was there at the opening night of The Great Dictator in New York. I'll tell you how shocking that movie was. When he spoke of himself as a Jew, you realize that you had almost never heard the word Jew in a movie.
What do you think you're doing?
I know that sounds crazy, but I don't remember hearing the word Jew in any movie before The Great Dictator, American movie.
Der Leberwurst mit der Tschuten. Ey, der Flipsensack da mit der Tschuten. Ey, der Flipsensack der Klärten. Der Strängelchen mit der Hultensack der Fläten. Und der Blätzensack der Elten. Besick, Besack. Der Tschuten. Der Tschuten.
His Excellency has just referred to the Jewish people.
During a time when everyone was focusing on Hitler as a land grabber, The Great Dictator focused on Hitler as someone who was really dangerous, not just because he was taking up more territories, because he was willing to, in order to achieve his ideological ends, kill people.
We've just discovered the most wonderful, the most marvelous poison gas. It will kill everybody.
All right, later.
Chaplin's film inflamed Hollywood's critics, many of whom mistakenly suggested Chaplin himself was Jewish. The U.S. Senate formed the Nye-Clark Committee to investigate charges that Hollywood was encouraging anti-German bias. The committee cited The Great Dictator and Confessions of a Nazi Spy, among others, as evidence of a Jewish conspiracy in Hollywood to propel the U.S. into war. Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota declared in a nationwide radio address that it was Jews, not Hitler, who posed the greatest threat to America. Nonetheless, many applauded Chaplin's message.
Out Caesar, out Nolus, Emperor of the world.
Comedy in the hands of gifted artists is a weapon that pierces our complacency, that forces us to acknowledge the absurdity of Nazism, goose-stepping, believing that orders given to you by your superiors must be followed without question.
The scene where Chaplin takes that globe and does almost a ballet with it. That scene itself, it's a small masterpiece. There's this man who's got the whole world in his hands. It's brilliant. It is so beautiful and so sinister at the same time.
The globe scene, with Hitler bouncing the globe all over the place, doing a kind of Busby Berkeley dance number, shows the power of film and what the power of film can convey, especially since that film was made before America's involvement in World War II.
By the early 1940s, Europe's Jews were rounded up by the Nazis by the tens of thousands. Beginning in June 1941, more than 1 million Jews would be shot by Nazi firing squads. In December the same year, the Nazis began the deportation of millions more to the death camps.
The Germans have promised to deliver to the world, by the end of the year, a Christmas package of 4 million dead Jews.
Some Americans protested, and leaders in the Jewish community pleaded with President Roosevelt to take action. Newspapers did present some of the facts of what was taking place in Europe, but few Americans understood or chose to believe the extent of what was occurring.
We'll take it to him. We'll be glad to.
Of course you will, Hugo.
It may not be easy. A concentration camp is not like an American prison.
Oh, I bet they're not half as bad as they say they are.
Walter Hoffman, radio technician, member of the underground, suspected of being connected with the illegal radio. Sent you from the concentration camp at Dachau, April...
We heard about concentration camps, and we just thought, as the Germans said, it was just a place that, that kept people. Nothing was ever mentioned about the ovens. Nothing was mentioned about the horrors that took place in the concentration camps.
This is a serious play, a realistic drama.
Good morning, Dervash.
Good morning.
How do you like my dress?
Very good, very good. It is a document of Nazi Is that what you're going to wear in the concentration camp?
Well, don't you think it's pretty?
That's just it.
Well, why not? I think it's a tremendous contrast.
Ernst Lubitsch's To Be or Not to Be starred Carol Lombard and Jack Benny.
Floor in this gorgeous dress.
That's a terrific laugh. That's right, Greenberg. You keep out of this.
See, Colonel,
Like The Great Dictator, the film was a pointed comedic attack on Nazi ideology. And it too was mired in controversy. But this time, critics attacked Hollywood for what they saw as an appalling lack of taste.
Heil Hitler!
Heil myself.
Not bad.
Other films about Nazism were sensationalistic, even titillating.
Not bad at all. Except the glasses. What you need them for, little one?
Take your glasses off.
But I need them for reading. Please. Please don't take them.
Mr. and Mrs. Duck were expecting.
Hollywood's vision of Germany was marked by an innocence that was in stark contradiction to the growing body of information about Hitler's war.
What's this, a dark horse?
In December 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and Americans joined the war. Overnight, isolationism became a thing of the past, and Hollywood led the country's propaganda effort. But Hollywood films more often focused on the war in the Pacific and themes of teamwork and overcoming unbeatable odds. American movies about Nazism, now vetted by the Government Office of War Information, in addition to the production code, often promoted the idea that there was no obstacle so great that a good dose of American democracy couldn't fix.
Get this straight, Emil. Whether you like it or not,
You'll play according to the rules. And don't kid yourself that just because we want to help you, we're soft, or that you can put anything over on us again. As a matter of fact, it's about time that you and your people in Germany woke up to the fact that we can be just as tough as you can, and a lot tougher.
This is our last journey. It doesn't matter if it's long or short.
It was the B pictures, often by refugee directors, that allowed a more serious look at Nazism.
Believing that we would achieve justice.
These lower budget films, without big stars, were rarely sold overseas and were churned out so fast that they often fell below the radar of the production code and other censors.
And I say to you, let us choose to fight. Here, now!
Drive them in!
Hitler's final solution, the systematic murder of all Europe's Jews, became German state policy in January 1942. Within a few months, gas chambers were in operation at 6 death camps. The American government, now fully engaged in a war with Hitler, would be haunted by actions not taken.
In August 1942, the State Department received a telegram telling us that there was under consideration at Hitler's headquarters a plan to murder all of the European Jews, that they were speaking of the final solution to the Jewish question, and the method involved was also discussed, namely the use of Zyklon B and gassing. We had information, and we had the information early. We didn't act on that information.
We were sitting in the concentration camp in Auschwitz, and an American plane was flying over our head. If the American bombers would put only one bomb on the railway stations before Auschwitz, the 400,000 Jews that came in the last moment from Hungary and were killed, they will not be killed.
As the war raged on, it would be captured on film by a select group of Hollywood professionals enlisted to serve. Many of the world's finest filmmakers, including Frank Capra, John Huston, Billy Wilder, and George Stevens, covered the war as documentarians for the Army Signal Corps Motion Picture Unit. In April 1945, the German army was in full retreat. When the concentration camps were liberated, Hollywood cameramen were there. The combat photographers were allowed inside the camps even before the Army medical units. Days later, 8 men from the 1st Motion Picture Unit of the Army Air Corps, comprised mostly of Warner Brothers employees, gathered in a screening room to view the new footage from abroad.
We were in the cutting room, and I got a call to come into the projector because there was some very, very special film. One of the gentlemen who brought the film in said, "This is the roughest stuff you're ever going to see in your life." We sat in the projection room, and you could hear a pin drop. It was so silent. We could hear the whir of the projector in the back. And we heard the projectionist give a yell when he saw it, because he had not seen it.
We were all shocked. And to this day, I can recall the scenes from this film. It was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen, because the inmates walking in their black and white uniforms looked like ghosts.
We saw the bodies, the half-dead bodies, the half-alive bodies, and the ex-prisoners hanging on the barbed wires, and the bodies in a heap. We saw about 20 minutes of this, and I and about 2 other people, we had to go outside. I threw up. I mean, it was just devastating to us.
Only weeks after the war in Europe ended, 12 Hollywood moguls, on the invitation of General Eisenhower, flew overseas to see for themselves the horror of the camps. After 2 weeks of traveling through war-torn Europe, the moguls spent a day in Dachau.
They saw the ovens. They saw the piles of dead, which had not been buried, you know. They couldn't believe it.
Here are the masters of the most powerful medium in the world. The idea, I think, was that they should bear witness. They should bear witness personally, and then, I think Eisenhower and the State Department hoped, they would also bear witness through their films.
Shaken by the experience, the Hollywood executives vowed to return to Hollywood and make movies that would educate the world. Some made public declarations of their intention to incorporate Nazi atrocities into their films. Jack Warner wrote, "No one connected with motion pictures who has seen these things can allow themselves to assume responsibility for a screen which portrays only a make-believe world."
After that, they had what we would call knowledge. What they were supposed to do with that knowledge was to use their skills to tell the story and to make sure that this was understood. And for a period of time, the newsreels did tell a very important reality. And you have, during this period of time, the films that were taken. The most startling of which is the epical scenes of the bulldozers at Bergen-Belsen, shoveling the bodies into mass graves that left the people who saw that in the theaters absolutely numb.
By early May, all of the major newsreels featured graphic footage of Nazi atrocities. The film Daily reported record-breaking audiences.
The film that they shot in the concentration camp, I can't get that out of my mind. That is at the core of my understanding of what went on in that part of the world during World War II.
For those who saw the newsreel footage in the months after the war, the graphic images would be etched in their memories. But it was only a matter of months before the footage was put away, not to be seen again for several years. It would take decades before filmmakers with studio backing would be able to tell the story.
From the word go, it was not a subject that was particularly appealing to audiences. Maybe they didn't want to be reminded of their own anti-Semitism and racism. Maybe people don't go to movies to feel awful about themselves and what they are and what they do.
Mainstream Hollywood's response to the Nazi atrocities was encompassed in two films about anti-Semitism, released within months of each other in 1947.
Mr. Green is going to do a series on anti-Semitism for us. Really?
Crossfire and Gentleman's Agreement were both hailed within the industry for their courage, but neither mentioned the Nazis or the murder of European Jews.
The worst, the most harmful thing you can possibly do now.
Not at all. Why is it a harmful idea?
Because it'll only stir it up more. That's why. Let it alone. We'll handle it in our own way.
The hush-hush way?
In American culture, a virtual silence surrounded the subject of Nazi atrocities.
Many artists, filmmakers, novelists, historians thought that it was simply too soon, that we weren't capable of understanding. It was not capable of any illumination because it hadn't quite sunk in.
There's another factor here, and that is that the United States very rapidly wanted to rehabilitate Germany after the war. We wanted to create a democracy there that would be hospitable to American ideas, American values, American goods. So the last thing that Hollywood wanted to do at that point was to make films that would somehow alienate a group of people that America was trying to woo.
Even among those who had a story to tell, the 140,000 refugees who made their way to the United States, including survivors of the camps, few spoke about their experiences, and perhaps fewer were asked.
I spent 31 months in 4 different camps. I was liberated in Buchenwald. I never wanted to talk about it, which is not unusual. A lot of survivors did not want to talk about their experiences. They want to live a life. Okay, we survived. They did not kill us all. Now, what do I do with my life?
A lot of people were ashamed to tell their story. I never told my story to anybody. Nobody asked and nobody told.
Can't you say anything except, I don't know? They must have taught you yes or no in some language.
Silence was a theme in the few smaller films of the post-war era that addressed the subject.
No, pas français.
Fred Zinnemann's The Search, starring Montgomery Clift, is about a 9-year-old survivor rendered mute by his experiences.
Concentration camp. What's A?
A for Auschwitz. Were you in Auschwitz, kid?
Singing in the Dark is the story of a man so traumatized by his experiences in a concentration camp that amnesia makes him oblivious to his own past.
When you're downhearted, gloomy, and sorry, and you think that the whole world is wrong.
Yet in true Hollywood fashion, he is still able to sing of life's joys.
And burst into song. Lend an ear and you'll hear bells are ringing. Let the gold of the sun kiss your hair. Keep on living and loving and singing. There is beauty and joy everywhere. Everybody!
This is your life, Hannah Black-Conner.
Oh, no!
Yes?
It was network television, produced in Hollywood, that first found a way to package the Holocaust for mass consumption. On May 27, 1953, This Is Your Life featured the story of Auschwitz survivor Hannah Black-Conner.
That looking at you, it's hard to believe that during 7 short years of a still short life, you lived a lifetime of fear, terror, and tragedy. You look like a young American girl just out of college, not at all like a survivor of Hitler's cruel purge of German Jews.
That's where I first met Hannah.
Oh, Eva!
We spent about 8 months in that camp.
The show featured surprise reunions with one of the American soldiers who liberated her and a fellow concentration camp inmate.
Who was your friend and companion in 4 concentration camps. Now, fate was kind to her, too, for she lives here in Hollywood now. Eva Hertzberg, now Mrs. Warner Florsheim.
Oh, Eva.
You were each given a cake of soap and a towel, weren't you, Hannah?
I don't remember the song.
Well, you were sent to the so-called showers, and even this was a doubtful procedure because some showers had regular water, others had liquid gas, and you never knew which one you were being sent to. You and Eva were fortunate, others were not so fortunate, including your father and mother and your husband, Carl Benjamin. They all lost their lives at Auschwitz. Now, we know that you and Walter have been saving up your money in the hope that someday you, Hannah...
Hannah's story was presented as traditional narrative, with a love story, an orchestral underscore, and a happy ending.
The last time you were in touch with Gottfried was in a Nazi concentration camp nearly 10 years ago. Now, here he is from Israel, your brother, Dr. Gottfried Black.
You've had a lot of sensational testimony about Hollywood. From some of it, the public would get the idea that Hollywood is running over with communists and communism.
Could you tell the committee whether or not you are now have ever been a member of the Communist Party?
By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the vernacular of Nazi atrocity had made its way into common discourse, surfacing during the hearings of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In a coordinated strategy, some of Hollywood's most successful producers and writers who were called to testify invoked Nazism in their defense.
You were using the old technique which was used in Hitler Germany in order to create a scare here.
We felt we were getting attacked in the same way, that this was a dangerous thing. This was part of the rise of fascism in the United States.
Your purpose is to use this to disrupt the motion picture industry.
Many of those who testified had been active in the anti-Nazi movement of the 1930s. The hearings left the American public with the impression that Jews, communism, and Hollywood were inextricably linked, further inhibiting the studios from tackling Jewish-themed subjects.
I should like to see what you have.
The witness is excused. Impossible.
It would not be until 1959 that Hollywood would once again address the Holocaust. It did so through the universal coming-of-age story of a young teenage girl.
We were going to disappear, vanish into thin air.
The Anne Frank film, I think it deals with life rather than with death. It deals with a young woman and her aspirations living in this cooped-up space. It's her observations of coming of age, and soft sells what happened to Anne after she leaves the attic.
What's the good of thinking of misery when you're already miserable? That's stupid.
The 1959 Hollywood adaptation of The Diary of Anne Frank arrived at a time when the book had already sold millions around the world.
Look at us.
Go on, look further.
The film itself was based on a hit Broadway play.
Anne Frank is a very interesting manifestation of both Hollywood and America.
Diary. I've never had a diary.
They tried to make Anne Frank more universal and less Jewish so that it would be more appealing to an American audience.
Drink your milk. The trouble with you.
The feeling was at that point that you cannot make it to the screen in America if you're that ethnic. This is the 1950s. The rule of the 1950s was if you want to get ahead, you have to go along.
Let me give you a little advice, young lady.
The 50s was the kind of post-war boom, happiness, placidness, real domesticated family lives. And I think that clearly to focus Anne Frank's story about what was happening outside the attic may have been too much for a 50s audience to understand.
Director George Stevens, a two-time Oscar winner, was perhaps the most successful Hollywood filmmaker of the era. During the war, Stevens had led the Army Signal Corps unit that had filmed in Dachau just after the liberation. Deeply moved by that experience, Stevens saw in Anne Frank a chance to make what he called his war movie. Yet prior to its release, Stevens made a point of assuring the world that his film would not venture into uncomfortable territory. Anne Frank, he said, would be devoid of Nazi horrors.
The dream sequence was really the only glimpse you saw of the concentration camp in the film. There have been critics of the film who said, well, you never showed the concentration camp. But this was her story, and the audience knew where she was going. Dad, just having seen the reality of it, he wasn't interested in putting that in front of an audience. He knew that the audience was perceptive. And in The Diary of Anne Frank, he knew he didn't have to spoon-feed them information.
I want to bring out all kinds of things.
Hovering over this was the knowledge of how she died. Should that have been shown? Should the fact that she went into a death camp and that she had to walk through that door be shown? That's as graphic as you could get with her. Shouldn't have been, that's a creative choice to make. So it depends on the story.
I think the world may be going through a phase, the way I was with Mother. It'll pass. maybe not for hundreds
Toward the
of
very
years.
end of Anne Frank's diary, she says what is emblematically American.
I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are really good at heart.
The reality is you cannot come out of understanding the Holocaust by saying that you believe that people are good at heart. People may be good at heart, but the Holocaust is certainly no manifestation of that.
April 16th, 1959, live from Television City in Hollywood.
These defendants are the embodiment of what passed for justice in the Third Reich.
Just 2 months after the premiere of Anne Frank, it was television that offered a harsher look at the Holocaust. Judgment at Nuremberg, a teleplay by Abby Mann, was based on the real-life trial of German judges at the 1947 Nuremberg trials.
Why did we sit silent? Why did we participate? Because we loved our country.
The antagonist of this thing is patriotism. Patriotism, and how, in the name of patriotism, we can allow terrible things to happen. Here were these judges who were supposed to protect the society, who could have stopped it, but didn't. How could they go along with this?
I'm ashamed that such things could have taken place in my country.
What was it about?
It is inexcusable.
It was the guilt. Who's guilty?
If he is to be found guilty...
Are all Germans guilty? Are some Germans guilty? Are there shades of guilty? Is everyone guilty?
Who must also be found guilty. What about the rest of the world, Your Honor? Did it not know the intentions of the Third Reich?
But the show's message was ultimately compromised by last-minute network tampering.
Did it not read his intentions in Mein Kampf, published in every corner of the world?
About the dress rehearsal time, the network vice presidents and one of the sponsors came to them.
This stunning Magic Chef gas range.
The sponsor was the American Gas Company, and they said, you've got to cut the word gas out of the show.
See why today more people than ever are cooking with gas.
So instead of the gas chambers, they said we took them to the bleep chambers.
But how in the name of God can you ask me to understand the extermination of millions of men, women, and innocent children for the sake of a political expediency?
Now, our alert media took that as a message of the film. Forget the two-thirds of Jews in Europe. Forget everything else. My God, they pumped out the words gas.
2 years later, Judgment at Nuremberg was remade as a feature film. The film accentuated the role of the American judge, now played by Spencer Tracy.
We are the heroes of that story, too. The Americans came in, they and the Russians liberated the concentration camps, and then we took it upon ourselves to impose judgment on the murderers. And it does have a very glorifying, heroic image of Americans who were sent there to do justice.
The place from which you remember an event shapes the nature of what you remember. In Poland, you tell the story of the Holocaust one way. In Berlin, you tell it another way. In America, the story of the Holocaust does not teach the differences between people, but the notion that society must be broad enough and bold enough and wide enough to encompass all.
This is what we stand for. Justice, truth, and the value of a single human being.
The feature film version of Judgment at Nuremberg, directed by Stanley Kramer, boasted an all-star cast.
Were you present when the films we are about to see were taken?
Yes, I was.
But the real star was the film within the film. Atrocity newsreel footage from the liberated camps that had been presented in the courtroom during the actual trial, and now to a new generation of moviegoers.
Okay.
Inmates were made to leave their clothing on a rack. They were told they were going to take baths. Then the doors were locked. Tins of Cyclone B were released through the specially
The
constructed...
significance of that scene is that it shows what we're talking about. And I think until that scene, there's a kind of abstraction to the evil.
3 minutes.
There's something about turning out the lights and turning on a projector and illuminating images onto a screen and then immediately have a kind of sense of recognition that now we see what you're talking about. Now we recognize the crime.
Those were...
You get a sense of the ultimate Exhibit A.
which also specialized in baking ovens.
The same year as the release of Judgment at Nuremberg, a real-life courtroom drama brought the events of World War II into the American living room. In 1961, every week for over 4 months, the major networks broadcast highlights of the trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. But the real drama began when the focus shifted from the perpetrator to the victims.
They started to read from this registration list, and by 2 walked down the grave, had to lay down with side by side, with their faces down, and were shot.
My mother, she was 43. My brother, who was 22. I was 21. My sister was 19. My brother was 16.
And who of all those members of your family remained alive?
Only myself.
In 1965, The Pawnbroker, directed by Sidney Lumet, depicted a Holocaust survivor, Saul Nazarman, who 20 years after the war is still haunted by his experiences.
Tell me, does blood ever flow through you, Saul Nazarman? You breathe, you eat, you walk, you make money, you take a dream and give a dower, and give no hope. Survive. A coward's survival, and at what a price. No love, no passion, no pity. Dead. Saul Nazarman, the walking dead.
Unlike mainstream Hollywood efforts, the film attempted to recreate life in a concentration camp.
How do you portray it? I had a sense of discomfort because somehow or other I didn't know how one avoided exploitation. I mean, the film itself is not creating the shock or the importance of the moment dramatically. It's predicated on your knowledge that, 1, this was true, 2, it happened on an enormous scale, literally. Millions. And therefore, in that sense, it's exploitive. It was not something that came to you simply because of the movie itself.
It is a film about memory, or, in the case of Saul Nazarman, repression of memory, that therefore leads to explosions.
Nobody won.
To uncontrollable, involuntary memory.
My diamond engagement ring, I want to borrow.
It's glass.
You have flash cuts. It'll last less than a second, the shot, and then you go back to the present tense, and then the past comes back for about a second, then it comes back for 2 seconds, and then 4 seconds, until it takes over. It's a brilliant analog for the way that the mind works.
Memory is difficult enough to do without it becoming a cliche. But there was the double problem here. It wasn't just memory, it was memory that was being fought. He didn't want to remember any of this. So I simply went back to the simplest thing, which is how my own memory works, if I'm trying to avoid something. It was quite a literal interpretation of what happens in my own head, which is that if I'm fighting it, it'll flash, and then finally it smashes through of its own volition.
One could say that The Pawnbroker is the perfect film to have been made in the early 60s, because the way in which Saul Nazarman deals with his memories is perhaps related to how the American sensibility could deal with the realities of the Holocaust. It's sputtering. It's not yet absorbed. It's certainly not yet mainstreamed.
The end, when he comes out and the boy's been shot, I had one of the best moments I've ever had in acting. I was involved, I was upset, I was crying. And then my intellect came in and said, I was supposed to scream, don't make a sound. I put my head back and I did a silent scream, which was twice as powerful as if I would have screamed. Because you put your scream in my mouth.
It's a silent scream. It's the voice of the survivor. I think the film ends with a question mark. What happens to this man? Is he totally destroyed by the events of the war, the Holocaust, or does this allow him some moment of regeneration? I think it's unanswered. I think it's part of the brilliance of the film.
Lumenthal, you are blind. You're absolutely blind. You can't see what's going on in front of your own face.
What do you mean? Ah, you mean this business about the Jews? You don't understand us. The German Jew is something special. Yeah, Germans first, and Jews second. We have done so much for Germany. Germany has done so much for us. A little patience, a little goodwill. It works itself out. Listen, there are nearly 1 million Jews in Germany. What are they going to do? Kill all of us?
In the late 60s and early 70s, a growing consciousness of the Holocaust informed even films that weren't overtly about the subject. Audiences who saw the producers knew enough about the Third Reich to get the joke that a Broadway musical on the subject would be in poor taste and destined to fail. Yet these same audiences knew enough about American culture to understand why it might succeed. Brief Holocaust imagery could be used to imply a backstory that need not be embellished, or to serve as metaphor for something else. In Bob Fosse's Cabaret, the portrayal of the decadence of pre-war Berlin resonated in the era of Vietnam, free love, and civil unrest.
The type of individuals who created the atmosphere in Mississippi and all over the South. And it's the same kind of mind that created Hitler's Germany.
Off-screen, civil rights leaders invoked the Holocaust as a rallying cry, as Jews and blacks joined forces in a movement that would change America and heighten ethnic identity.
We share the profound concern of millions of people.
After all of the enormous immigration in the early part of the 20th century, everyone is expected to be an American, to look like an American, to act like an American. But by the time you get to the 1960s and 1970s, that model is now obsolete. Suddenly you have the idea that ethnicity is to be celebrated.
Good line.
In 1977, a decade after the height of the civil rights movement, ABC aired Roots, a miniseries about slavery. To the surprise of network executives, the series scored higher ratings than any entertainment program in history. Seemingly overnight, Americans became more introspective about a shameful chapter in their own past. The week Roots aired, a rival network gave the green light to another miniseries. NBC's 9-hour Holocaust attempted to cover the full sweep of Hitler's Germany, from Kristallnacht in 1938 to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and finally, the death camps and Hitler's final solution. All told through the experiences of an assimilated German Jewish family.
He didn't say.
There's no place left to go, Papa. Nobody wants us. That's right.
The idea was that in order to get the audience to identify with this Jewish family, they had to personify something that was very much part of the American experience. People who came from somewhere else and became assimilated into the culture. Holocaust was a depiction of the Holocaust through one family that seemed to have been everywhere and done everything. It condensed everything into one complete narrative, a beginning, a middle, and an end. It put everything into one complete narrative linked by one human story. And that's the magic of Hollywood. The magic of Hollywood is not the abstract, it's the concrete, it's the personification.
I've had a long journey, my friend.
Berlin, Warsaw, Auschwitz. It wasn't any vacation.
No vacation. You've been a good friend.
The series was broadcast over 4 consecutive nights in 1978. 1 in every 2 Americans tuned in.
It got vast audience ratings. In New York City, during commercial breaks, the water pressure in the city actually went down because so many people went to the bathroom at the same time. It was a phenomenon, and it was a far greater phenomenon than any of us could have predicted.
But the film's producers were unprepared for the strong emotions that the film would provoke. In the New York Times, writer and survivor Elie Wiesel lashed out, calling the project morally objectionable and indecent.
Almost everyone had operated under the assumption that just dealing with the Holocaust is good, that you're bearing witness, and what could possibly be bad about bearing witness? And what Wiesel does is he says, no, it's not just about bearing witness. It's about how you bear witness. That any representation really trivializes the event. That this is something that is beyond any kind of traditional narrative form. So what you're getting is this kind of war between narrative on the one hand and history on the other.
This is an NBC News special report. Holocaust, a postscript.
For a long time, many persons considered the Holocaust too difficult a matter to discuss, too painful an event to relive through drama, especially in the view of some critics, television drama.
I do think it was soap opera-ish.
For the first time, a filmic depiction of the Holocaust became fodder for a national debate.
It's not that it was bad, that it wasn't good enough. It didn't rise to the dimensions of the horrors and the heritage that perished in the Holocaust.
I know that there were a number of people who were very upset by it. They were upset by the fact that there were commercials. It was television. It was a commercialization, in quotes, of the Holocaust. My response is that I watched teenagers watch that program, and it had an enormous effect upon them. It was a new generation who, in America, had their first acquaintance with this horrific topic.
It was a big thing all over the country. What I chiefly remember, though, is the stories I heard about the impact in Europe. Here it was big news, but over there it was reality. Come home.
The television program Holocaust, about the execution of Jews by Nazis during World War II, began appearing on West German television this winter.
More than one-third of the West German people saw it. The response was unprecedented.
Chancellor Helmut Schmidt was among the millions who watched the Holocaust series.
In Germany, the impact of the miniseries was profound. As a direct result of the broadcast, the German legislature extended the statute of limitations on Nazi war criminals.
In Germany, they told a joke, a cynical joke about the impact of the docudrama The Holocaust. They said it had more impact than the original.
That it would take this American miniseries to make people aware of something that went on in their own backyards, that their own parents were, to some extent, responsible for. It's totally ironic. It's very amusing, really.
Worldwide, perhaps the biggest impact was on the survivors themselves. In response to the miniseries, news crews and documentary filmmakers approached survivors who now began to tell their stories on film.
Now, when selections were carried out to the gas chambers, people were stripped, mostly they were stripped. Naked, put into there, block 25.
I saw a documentary called Kitty Return to Auschwitz. And I turned to my wife and said, you know, 36 years I didn't talk, and it's time for me to wake up and do something about it.
I am a survivor of the Jewish Holocaust. And like most survivors, I never wanted to talk about my experiences.
I think survivors simply started telling their stories when they felt that there were people who wanted to receive the stories and who were open to receive the stories.
These hands have carried more corpses than I ever cared to remember. Families and friends.
We are the people who saw it, and we would like that what we know.
Talk shows had survivors coming in. People were calling from all across America, what happened to you? Tell me your story. And all of a sudden the survivor was talking, and now something else happened. The American people were listening.
I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to tell you something now I have never told anybody.
Almost 20 years after the silent anguish of the pawnbroker, Sophie's Choice tells the story of a survivor who reveals her secrets. The film was based on a best-selling novel by Pulitzer Prize-winning author William Styron. It told the post-war story of a Polish, non-Jewish survivor living in Brooklyn with her boyfriend and their downstairs neighbor, the Southerner Stingo.
I love that piece. Thanks to my perfect German.
Sophie's Choice was produced at a time when an unprecedented number of documentaries conveyed the horrors of the Holocaust solely through the words of the witnesses themselves. Director Alan Pakula and his crew grappled with the challenge of portraying a fictional Holocaust story, accurately and morally. Survivors were hired to consult during production.
Kitty Hart was a survivor of Auschwitz, and she was our consultant. She was meticulous in recounting the daily little bits of life in that horror place. And one of the things that she told us was the Auschwitz walk. because Auschwitz was, most of the year, the time she was there, she remembered it as always muddy. And the Auschwitz War consisted of moving your feet and aiming at the other people who came before you, their footprints, so you wouldn't have to plow in and plow up mud, which was so hard to do with no energy. So it became almost a way of life, survival there, to walk that way. That's a thing that it's hard for any director just to make up, that walk, that painful walk.
The emotional climax of the movie is a scene of excruciating horror, yet there's no bloodshed or physical violence.
Du kannst eins von den Kindern behalten.
Wie bitte?
Du kannst eins von den Kindern behalten. Das andere muss weg.
Wollen Sie mir sagen, dass ich wählen muss?
Du bist ein Polak und kein Jude. Also, hast ein gewisses Vorrecht.
Ich kann nicht wählen. Ich kann nicht wählen.
Halt's Maul.
Ich kann nicht wählen.
Komm, ich schick sie beide weg. Ich schick beide Kinder weg.
Zwingen Sie mich nicht zu wählen. Ich kann nicht wählen.
Ich schick sie beide darüber.
Ich kann nicht wählen.
Nehmen Sie beide Kinder weg. Ja, ist nicht! Los!
Nehmen Sie meine Kleine!
Los!
Nehmen Sie meine Kleine! Nehmen Sie das Mädchen! Nehmen Sie das Mädchen!
It's hard to portray what the real horror was. That scene shows the bestiality of the Nazis without showing flesh burning in an oven or people being gassed and dying. To show graphic horror is very tough, and that's the dilemma in these films. How much do you show without turning off people watching?
I found a ravine outside the town.
In 1988, ABC broadcast the 30-hour miniseries War and Remembrance, based on Herman Wouk's best-selling novel. Embedded within the story of a family of Americans and their European relatives was the Holocaust, told more graphically on television than ever before.
It was very strong. I had never before or since seen anything like that. I think it shakes people up. I think being that graphic in a world where you almost have to compete for attention, and a subject as important as the Holocaust, if it's not done honestly, and honestly means graphically, it's not going to seem any more or less violent than any scene from any John Wayne Moore movie.
Something had happened between the docudrama The Holocaust and War and Remembrance. And I think it happened even earlier. I think it happened in part with Vietnam and the coarsening of the American experience, which is in order to get attention and in order to hold the people, you have to show graphic imagery. And the more graphic, in one sense, the more powerful. And that stretched what was capable of being shown on national television.
I said, if I'm to take this on, the most important thing is that I be allowed to approach the Holocaust material the way I think it should be done. In terms of the graphic intensity of what I showed, what we were doing was telling the story of the Holocaust. We have to show it. Well, certainly we couldn't show everything, and certainly we couldn't come close to what actually happened. But if we came reasonably close, we hopefully would accomplish our mission. We reconstructed the tracks into Auschwitz so we could actually run the train in. We built the crematorium. We built the exterior 50 yards away from where crematorium 4 was at Auschwitz. We had found the plans and specifications, and we constructed that exterior exactly.
Are there events that simply should not be imagined or fictionalized? Because in some ways, by definition, they are unimaginable. That's the world of atrocity. Something that is truly unimaginable, something that is purely horrific, something that has no redemption because it has no precedent, something about it that is unreal. And the idea that we can recreate the event through props and set pieces and costuming and makeup is in many ways a desecration.
In 1993, Hollywood's complicated relationship to the Holocaust seemed to reach a culmination with Schindler's List. The director was Steven Spielberg, the most commercially successful Hollywood filmmaker in history.
Here was a man that was capable of making a film that everyone would eventually see. And so when Steven Spielberg turned his attention to the Holocaust, some people, I think, believe that that would be incredible because it would illuminate a subject that might, for some people, have been not present in their consciousness, and for others feared what he would produce because it would then become the singular image, the singular piece of cinema that educated the world as to what the Holocaust was and meant.
Schindler's List, based on a book by Thomas Keneally, is set in Krakow, Poland, beginning in 1941, when the city's 20,000 Jews are forced from their homes and sent first to the ghetto and then to the nearby labor camp of Pleshow.
The investors.
But the focus of the film is Oskar Schindler, a Nazi industrialist who saves over 1,000 of Krakow's Jews by allowing them to work in his factory.
How many?
It is a very extraordinary story, which is dramatically atypical of the Holocaust. The hero is German. The hero is a German Nazi who's a profiteer, who says, I can go along with Nazism up to a point, but then he sees what it represents, and slowly he backs away and then becomes enormously heroic.
Films often have an audience surrogate. There has to be a character with whom the majority of the audience can identify. It's unlikely that that character is going to be either the Jew who has been victimized, brutalized, nor is it going to be the Nazi perpetrator or the guilty bystander. We don't want to identify with the person committing or watching evil. That leaves the decent observer who takes part, who finally says, I can no longer be indifferent.
Schindler's List, in some ways, is a kind of compendium of all the different approaches to the Holocaust. But I think the path-breaking component of that movie is that there is a kind of casualness about the violence. That's the shock of the film. Because in some ways, you can deal with violence in such an overwrought manner that in and of itself becomes a way of trivializing the events. It's almost the reticence of Schindler's List from a director who is not known for his reticence that makes it so effective.
We're talking about an industry of death. I know this sounds a little bit like hyperbole, but it was an industry. The way they document possessions, the careful paperwork as to each suitcase, every item from every suitcase that was taken, the fillings from the teeth, very careful records were taken of all these things. This is all the way the Nazis looked upon the Jews, as an industry. And the only byproduct, the only product coming out of that industry was ashes into the atmosphere.
He didn't want to show too much brutality because he was thinking it's maybe too much. I told him to make it more. He didn't want to do it. Steven said in one moment, I remember, he said, we are not making a documentary.
Schön gefangen, gut. Nochmal, ja. Schön.
I didn't want to glamorize it. I didn't want to shoot in color. I thought simply color would beautify the Holocaust. Color beautifies everything. And so my first choice to get rid of all the tools, all the basically the mainstays of in my arsenal of filmic weapons, like a camera crane, which I got rid of, you know, everything that had to do with slickness and beauty, I got rid of all of those devices. I didn't do any camera tricks, except this one moment where I wanted there to be color on the red winter coat of the little girl. That was how Thomas Tilly describes her, because Schindler made an observation when he was sitting on his horse and watching the liquidation of the ghetto. He noticed that no one was selecting the most obvious color in a very monochromatic scheme. And my interpretation of that was that America and Russia and England all knew about the Holocaust when it was happening, and yet we did nothing about it. We didn't assign any of our forces to stopping the march toward death, the inexorable march toward death. It was a large blood stain, primary red color on everyone's radar, but no one did anything about it. And that's why I wanted to bring the color red in.
More so than in previous Holocaust films, Spielberg and his team found a key to portrayal in the stories of the survivors themselves. The film is infused with details taken from hundreds of testimonies.
Yes. I don't like. No, you don't. What do you like? I like caviar.
Schindler's List, it's about survival and about hope. There's 1,232 Jews that survived because that's their destiny. We don't show in the movie the 6 million that died. We're showing the 1,200 that survived.
But it was the film's message of hope itself that brought controversy. Some critics found fault with the film's happy ending and the fact that Jewish victims of the Holocaust were supporting players in the story of a heroic Nazi.
It's Hebrew from the Talmud. It says, whoever saves one life saves the world entire.
The question posed now was not whether Hollywood should attempt to tell the story of the Holocaust, but what story should be told and how.
Hollywood's a world that is capable of redemption, capable of a life-affirming sensibility, the possibility of endings that are relatively happy. So what Hollywood does with the Holocaust is find a way to tell a good story, but leave the audiences with a message of hope. Give them something that they can go home feeling good about themselves and the world in which they live. And that, of course, is the paradox when Hollywood turns its lens onto the Holocaust.
The ethos of Hollywood is, first of all, that it is the art of the middle, which means that it is meant to appeal to everyone. Hollywood's main function is to enable the audience to come to terms with whatever it's watching, whether it's romance, whether it's politics. And I think Hollywood is the means by which most people, for better or worse, come to terms with the Holocaust.
Schindler's List exceeded expectations, winning 7 Academy Awards and reaching a worldwide audience of more than 300 million people. The success of Schindler's List inspired a wave of Holocaust-themed films and television movies in the late 1990s and early 21st century. Many focused on themes of resistance and rescue. A television network made a new film about Anne Frank, but this time followed her story all the way to her death in Bergen-Belsen. And Hollywood celebrated and awarded 3 Oscars to The Pianist, directed by Roman Polanski, a survivor himself.
I say this, Mr. President, because it is happening again.
In Washington, D.C., politicians invoke the Holocaust as warning against the threat of genocide ever present in the world. And crowds flocked to a national Holocaust museum that was more extensive than any yet built in Europe. The Holocaust had become ingrained in American culture.
It's very much a part of our life and our history in America. It's what we're all about in the first place. The whole thing, the pursuit of freedom and the pursuit of happiness, presupposes a society in which there won't be racism. We stand for something. This is supposed to be what we're all about.
The Holocaust has become the negative absolute in American society. In a world of relativism, we don't know what's bad and we don't know what's good, but the one thing we can agree upon is this is absolute evil. And it's become the standard by which we judge evil, and therefore the standard by which we begin to establish values. Part of its attraction to filmmakers, part of its attraction to audiences is you're touching the absolute as you come closer to the truth of the Holocaust. And part of the failure of film, if it fails, is not to touch that absolute, not to go to the extreme.
We dominate world culture. We export it to the world, especially when it comes to film. Those images become seminal images all over the world. That's how they understand these events as well. They consume it, we make it. And we have a particular American philosophy on how to make these films. And therefore, because of that philosophy, I think we should be more careful about these representations because they tend to be diluting or trivializing or distorting or simply false.
We're approaching a time soon where the last survivor is going to die. There's going to be one person, a man or woman, left in the world, and then he or she will be the only eyewitness. That's always interested me. If I were to do one more movie, that would be it. What is the pressure on that last survivor? Because after that he or she are gone, you know, a decade after that, that memory is going to be living only in the newsreels and these films.
I know when I go, I will be one of the last survivors who is working in the film industry on the world. And when I go, there will be nobody anymore who can be on the set. And if somebody makes a mistake or something, to tell him how exactly was looking. How exactly was looking when somebody was hanged. And how exactly was looking when somebody was beaten, or how exactly the roll call was. I remember when the people were dying and they were telling us, be gesund and tell to the world how we died. And this should never happen again.